Hey there, Eugene here. So I was recently asked by some friends why did I start playing video games again. It's probably started this year, around maybe this summer. I found a bunch of programming games on Steam, and I actually started using this as part of my self-improvement, self-development program. And I started using it based on my assumption of what happens with reading literature and some of my research on the educational games. So the logic behind it is going back to explaining why to do it, right? So it's a matter of self-improvement. I don't necessarily do it because, oh, it's fun, I want to waste some time. But I believe it has some real world benefits in my performance in programming or do data science or data analysis. So the basic idea is that there's two types of knowledge. There's explicit knowledge, whereas this is codified knowledge. So you might say a name, a date, something you can codify, right? And the other type of knowledge is tacit knowledge. So tacit knowledge, you cannot necessarily codify it, even though literature, for example, is a form of codified information which can produce tacit knowledge based on the understanding of the social plots in the fiction or history. But basically, tacit knowledge is knowledge that you cannot necessarily hand down from one person to another. So for an example, a very common one would be bicycles, right? You can show someone how to ride a bike, you can write it down, show a video, etc. But that person is not going to learn how to ride a bike until he gets on the bicycle, tries it out. There's going to be some errors. He's going to fall down a few times until he gets it, right? So that click, that switch that happens in his brain that he gets it, that is tacit knowledge, right? So these are the two types of knowledge. So they're not necessarily one better than the other. They work together. So for example, if you're a chess player, the first 3 years of practicing chess, assuming you're practicing it on a daily basis in order to become, say, a grandmaster, the first 3 years you're going to be developing fundamental of tacit knowledge. But after that, if you want to increase your skills in chess, you need to read books. You need to have explicit knowledge. And if you don't do this, you're going to plateau. You get stuck in your performance at 3 years. And they done studies on this. You can Google chess deliberate practice, and there's a whole peer review research on this. So if all you do is play, for example, you're going to be stuck. And in 10 years, your performance is going to be about the same as when you were in your third year after 10 years. But if you read books and what have you, you will advance to the grandmaster level, assuming you got the ability and training for it. But at the same time, a lot of it depends on tacit knowledge. And if we all have known the book smarts concept, well, you have this professor or someone who reads a lot of books, but the guy's an idiot, right? He might read, say, for example, business books. I know so many of these guys that supposedly reads a crazy amount of business books, but they can't do crap. They can't really use Excel spreadsheet. They can't really negotiate, do a sale, etc. Or they do a very mediocre, low performance level, right? So reading books by itself is not going to give you that benefit, right? You need the real world experience. So now where games come from is that, why do we play games, right? This is one of the misconceptions a lot of people, the game development for instructor purposes get wrong. The people call themselves the gamification gurus, and those dumb all right, those guys, they have this concept that games are like this magical little thing where it's fun, right? It's fun, and they have like this Disneyland type mentality where it's like, and you're gonna magically learn and be fun. No. Like, what is the actual purpose of games? It has an evolutionary purpose, right? Mammals play games, and these technically higher mammals. So imagine lion cubs play fighting, goats or deer, it's ramming their horns in when they're young, etc. Chimpanzees and so on. They have a stage where they learn, and they're learning survival skills. So this might be hunting or avoiding prey. The big factor of it too is interspecies competition, right? Mainly the males fighting each other for territory, and once they get the territory, then females pick the males, right? That's the basic setup in the animal kingdom, even in social relationships, right? The male gains territory or resources, so has a little spot, and the females then pick them, and they usually do some displays like showing their feathers or doing some dance, etc. that shows their genetic superiority. But I mean, mainly you're fighting for freaking territory is what they do, right? So these skills are developed through play. So play is not this happy, smiley, thing. I mean, it is when you do it most of the time, but I mean, it has a serious survival mechanism that is made to make the person, quote unquote, more dangerous in the jungle, right? You are either a better predator, or you can avoid prey, and you are developing skills that will make you more dominant within your species, if this is a group species. All right, so that's basically the gist of it. So we have to tie the games, like, okay, this is just training for real world purposes. So once you get that concept, okay, you're gonna get that down, how do games work, right? So you got a lot of these your gamification guys or some other designers or game designers, software designers. How do you learn? They don't really go into it, right? They say there's studies that show that you can learn through play, but they don't necessarily explain any further details on that. Like there's some people to do. Ralph Koester in the book A Theory of Fun, and some of his blog posts is some of those insightful stuff I've ever read. But most people, they don't really go into the details of what the hell is going on. So when you play, you are moving your brain into I don't want to use the word consciousness because it's kind of like woo-foo, fluffy bunny type new age crap. But there's some changes that happens in consciousness. So there's some other parts of the brain that activates. So you start getting something that's called implicit learning, right? So if you ever notice, you ever noticed or heard, that probably did, time flies when you're having fun. The reason for this is that you have entered this consciousness, per se, that where you start having a lot of implicit knowledge or learning. So what implicit learning is that you're learning, but you don't realize you're learning. So an example of this would be, say, either yourself or someone you know has moved to a new part of the country or a different country, and they develop an accent after living a period of time over there, right? They didn't train for that accent most of the time. They didn't practice to develop this accent. They just started talking the way people around them talk, right? So this is part of implicit knowledge. You're learning how to communicate in a certain way based on the social relationships around you, which is entirely you learning without realizing you're learning it. So that's a form of implicit learning. So games or play are especially designed to trigger implicit learning, and this implicit learning is activating the memory lane. So this is an actual term for tacit knowledge. So implicit memory lanes or tacit knowledge memory lanes. And the other opposite would be explicit knowledge memory lanes. So you cannot learn both at the same time. Your brain either activates to learn explicit knowledge, which is memorizing dates and facts, which the 19th century type education system is based on, and a lot of stuff we even do today, right? We have to fill out those bubble sheet tests. And then you got the tacit knowledge. So the tacit knowledge is the real world experience, or that sort of knowledge like riding a bike, right? You cannot necessarily explain it, but you can do it, right? So playtime is literally focuses on tacit knowledge. So knowing that, that's pretty much what it's doing. Like, you're rewriting your brain. So an example was fiction, right? There's this whole branch of biology now. I think it's called Darwinism literature or something like that. There are books written about it. What's the name of the book? I read this a while back. Origins of Fiction is the name of the book. I can't remember who wrote it. I believe it's a guy from New Zealand, a professor. It's The Origins of Fiction. The Darwinism theory of why we read fiction or something like that. So books like that, for example, go on explaining why humans are into fiction, right? So fiction produces implicit learning and is very similar to play. So they find, and I can't remember, this is a basic viewpoint of archaeology or of specific niche in academia, but play into 3 factors. So you have actual play, which we understand as play, say it's like a child playing with dolls or toys, etc. Then we have fiction as a form of play, listening to fictional stories or writing them. And then we have art, drawing, music, right? So those are the 3 forms of play. And they have done cognitive studies of what happens when your brain is engaged in these types of play, and it supercharges the neurological connections within your brain. So it's literally making you smarter, and it's developing these tacit skill sets. So this is one of the reasons why children should be able to play. So back to why do I do it? So the type of games I work with specifically are games like Victoria, which you have here in the background. Like, this is insanely complex. I'm not sure if that's complex with Dwarf Fortress, but I mean, it's pretty complex game, as you can see around. Like, you're literally automating the whole factory, and you're getting inputs, outputs, etc. So I feel like games like this, some other games I have played in the past, for example, is Hacknet, Hackmud, another one, Gladiabots, 7 Billion Humans, Robo Instructors. These type of games, for example, have these programming skills set up. And I feel like when I start playing these, probably the beginning of this year, it did improve my work performance. I remember having this list of projects I have to do, right? So, like, okay, there's this or that issue with software. Gotta go back and try to figure all these things out. After playing this for a while, I would go back and stuff that I couldn't figure out, all of a sudden, it's a piece of cake. So it might have, well, it probably has two factors. It does have a factor of me working on something, you know, over time you develop skills in the real world. And you cannot just go ahead and play a game and believe you're going to have developed skills. You need real world skills. I can't remember the guy who said this, but he has a quote of the map is not the territory, right? He has some books written about this concept. I can't remember the guy's name. But the concept behind that is that you have to have real world experience. Like, the map is not the territory. And the same with games, which is one of the problems too with the gamification people, is that they focus overtly on the games. And you gotta realize that, yeah, there is some implicit knowledge, and games are useful at the beginning of learning something. So this is why it's pretty useful for children. But once you are an adult, there is a point of diminishing return that you're going to face, because you already have real world experience. So remember the chess player, right? So the first 3 years, the best thing you can do is actually playing chess and develop a tacit skill. But once you move past that, you have to start dedicating more and more time to reading actual books if you want to see your skill sets improve. If you continue playing, your skill sets are going to be stagnated. The same with games. It's kind of like a scaffolding, right? You got to realize that once you develop a certain skill set, there will be a point of diminishing return in a lot of the games. And B, the other problem with games that a lot of these gamification or like game designers, what have you, programmers don't address is that a lot of even though if you're learning, this does not mean that the learning is going to be applied to the real world. You can be learning a lot of nonsense and it's just not going to apply. They done study, for example, with the game company Luminosity. I believe that's how you say it. Pretty much like this little app you get and play this little game, like memory games and so on. Supposedly it's going to increase your brain performance, and from this brain performance, you're going to perform better in the real world. So they've done several studies on it, and you will improve in the game, but you're not necessarily going to have those real world benefits happening into the real world from playing the game. So there's some exceptions. For example, the game Flash Azan, which is flashing numbers into a screen for a fraction of a second, and then the student needs to use what's called a soroban, which is an abacus from Japanese purposes. And I did this for a while, and it does work. Like, I didn't become so skilled as the Japanese at doing it as children, but if you do this, pretty much you have the numbers flashed in, and depending on the rules, you might be adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing, right? So you have the numbers flash in. You don't start until the numbers stop flashing. So you have to keep in your mind the numbers that have flashed on the screen. And with these numbers, use the abacus soroban to do the arithmetic that will solve the problem. So what this is training, for example, this is what we call working memory, where you hold pieces of information and you work with this piece of information on a task. And I believe this is very, very useful. So this is one example where you can have a real world impact from games, but this doesn't happen all the time. And it's kind of hard to predict, or I don't know if hard, maybe impossible, what will and will not work. So a lot of this game design theories, you just have to test it out. And another example will be game Dual Endback. I believe that one has been proven to increase your working memory also, and your working memory impacts pretty much almost every aspect of your life. And then you got other studies, for example, done for with League of Legends or StarCraft 2, where they've done studies on what's called the executive function of the brain. So this is one of the reasons why I specifically started playing the games like this. So the executive function of the game is very, very complex thinking. So you're using pretty much the frontal lobe in order to create strategies and understand interrelationship of factors and go ahead and be able to, I don't know, do X. Right, so these are it's called the executive function or executive intelligence specifically. So complex games, like I said, StarCraft 2 or League of Legends, thus improve your executive functions. So this is the idea behind it. So in a similar way, complex literature increases your intelligence. And there's other books, for example, if you read Charles Hill, he has a book called Grand Strategies. And one of his partners from the same program from Yale University, this came with another book called On Grand Strategies, which kind of has the same concept here. Pretty much saying that in order to develop your strategy skills, you need to read fiction. And what Charles Hill specifically says with that is that what fiction does is that, or literature specifically, it has what's called the, I believe he called the pre-academic understanding of the world, where you, in your brain, you're connecting the economy, finance, politics, logistics, warfare, independent relationships between people, right? Philosophy, etc. So you're combining all these complex things and getting an understanding how they work together instead of focusing only on logistics, so only on philosophy, only on politics. You get a broader understanding how all these things work together, right? And you are able from this to understand the real world better and understand the relationships between things. And this is applied to a real world. And there have been other studies I've read, I can't remember the guy's name, I've written about this elsewhere, where they literally associate fiction or literature as a simulation in the brain where you are understanding the interrelationships of these different things in social relationships. So the idea is that in order to understand, and this is key, in order to understand the book of literature you are reading or understanding, reading or engaging in, you have to develop a certain neurological pattern to understand that complex story, right? And once you have developed that neurological pattern to understand that complex story, that neurological pattern doesn't just go away or go unused. What's happening is that now that same neurological pattern used to understand complex stories, either history or fiction, mainly literature, these might be things like Thucydides, like the Peloponnesian War and stuff like that, right? These might be real history, but it serves the same function. In order to understand that, you have to develop these neurological patterns, like I said. But now that you have them, you use these same neurological patterns into the real world in order to understand the real world and engage the real world. So the idea behind complex games that force your executive function is that you have to have some changes that happen in the brain in order to understand these. So once you have these changes created in the brain, these neurological patterns will be applied into the real world. So if you play a complex game like this one here, Factorio, you have to start developing certain neurological connections that allow you to understand the complexity that's going on this fictional virtual world. The same way you have to create neurological patterns to understand the complexities in complex literature. And once you have that complexity skills that's in your brain, they will be applied into the real world. So this is one of the things specifically why I've started reading literature a few years back. Usually I would just ignore. I try to read history, not literature, because I believe literature or fiction was the voice of time, until I started studying the research behind, like, oh crap, actually it's quite beneficial. So got into like Game of Thrones, like the Songs of Fire and Ice and so on. It's like complex stories. And this is one of the reasons why, again, I play games. But at the same time, you gotta realize, I'm not sure you gotta realize, but maybe someone, let's study that too, but it's not a be all end all. You still need real world experience. And, so you gotta balance it out. And there is a point of diminishing return. Like if you play too much games, you're wasting your time. We all have seen the hardcore gamers, and a lot of these guys have zero real world or social skills. They just can't communicate. They can't do crap. But they're excellent gamers. So you gotta realize there is a point of diminishing return. You have to get a feel for what that is. Another point here too is that, like kind of briefly mentioned too, a lot of the skills developed in the games are going to be useless. And you have to realize too, like for example, I remember seeing some games developed that were supposedly going to teach social skills or were going to be used on interviews. And they were going to be used in interviews to see if the candidates had social skills. And it pretty much is a bunch of NPCs in cartoons that were want to have a mock interview. You're sitting there and there's a camera, and the camera is going to track your eye movements and your responses and so on based on a video game. Like, oh my God, you got to realize, a video game is not going to have you develop social skills. It's going to do the exact opposite. If you want to develop social skills, you have to be talking to real people. The same with business. Like you have with the simulations of the stock market, and say they're going to teach you how to use stock markets. These can be useful for a short period of time, like scaffolding, right? So you understand some of the interrelationships between the different financial elements and so on. But you're going to have to abandon this quite quickly and start interacting in the real world and starting reading the news and talking to people, actually, then that's a lot more beneficial at times than what the hell is happening in the news. In order to understand the financial world, right? A game in this context is going to be very limited. But the one exception I believe that it's pretty useful, and I'm not sure if there's like complete waste of time, is technical skills, like say logistics, like you can see here, or programming, right? In this one, it's pretty much you're applying the same type of problem solving into the game as you're applying in your job. You got the different elements that interact. And yeah, I mean, it's pretty useful. Again, it's not complete. Say for example, you're designing a website. You probably know people that know how to design a website, like technical skills, but they don't have really a real understanding on real world skills. And they try to design something that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So that's one of the issues too. You have to have real world experience, but again, this is a good workout. So finalize this preview has probably gone a little longer than expected. Usually start rambling. But finalize, the argument I would make for this is that some games work in some conditions. You have to have an understanding of what are the games that are using executive functions and even social skills. Now to remember it, there was a study done by IBM, this one years ago, called Virtual Worlds Real Leaders, and you can probably find this for free on the internet. I read this years ago. It pretty much was a study based on IBM on their top managers managing geographically diverse regions. I believe that was the terminology they used. Pretty much was saying that people that are managing projects through email and phone calls or webinars, right? So there are in one part of the world, and they're managing this big project with moving parts through technology like telecommunications. And there was a correlation between these people playing online games, MMOs, like massive multiplayer online games, MMOs, like World of Warcraft or some similar stuff. So there's a correlation with their skill set or the leadership and the skills with a group of friends that have like real people are playing with their performance on this specific type of management, right? So this did not mean that this made them better managers, say, manage people in person, and that one you probably have to have real world skills, like real world skills, social skills, like interacting with people in person. But in that specific type of management, games like MMOs did increase real world performance of the managers. Again, correlation, that's an equal causation. You might argue what came first. Did people with these skills perform better in the game, or playing the game improves their performances? But like I said, studies on StarCraft 2 and League of Legends, where they have people that never played these type of games, have them tested for intelligent tests, and then have them play for X amount of time and go back and do the same test. There is an increase in performance if you do play complex games. Yeah, damn it, I lost my train of thought right there. But overall, if I were to put an argument, it's like, it's kind of like going to the gym, right? So going to the gym is not necessarily going to make you a world-class athlete by itself, right? So say a basketball player or whatever. But it's going to help, right? So playing a game isn't necessarily going to make you a star athlete, but it's going to improve it. Because what I think was happening here is that if you really think about this, if you really sit down and think about this, why are games so addicting? So my theory, this is just one of my thoughts. So there might be other people talking about this, but one of the ideas I have why games are so addicting is because in the real world, we are not performing a lot of the activities that we were, like, say, in a hunter-gatherer society. Say, for example, throwing stuff. like a spear, right? Our eyes and our brains are literally designed for us to be able to throw stuff, rocks, spears, etc. And there's a specific term for this, like temporal spatial reasoning, right? So temporal meaning time, spatial meaning space. So temporal spatial reasoning is your brain putting together the time and space factors and getting something down, like say throw a spear. And a lot of stuff you do in games is temporal spatial reasoning. And you know how you have a dog or like this fox or whatever, you keep it indoors, and they just start destroying the house and trying to dig. Like they might get a sofa and try to dig in the sofa as if it was dirt. Because biologically, they are made to be digging on the ground and doing these old activities outside the world. I believe games are a bent on some of these activities that we're biologically designed to perform, but we no longer have access to it. Like, for example, temporal spatial reasoning specifically. But that's a whole different thing. So the whole argument is like, yeah, the games that are complex require you to have these brain changes in order to perform in the game. You have a safe to fail environment. These brain changes causing your ability to handle complexity in the game will then be able to transfer into the real world. And you can improve your career, but again, there's a point of diminishing returns, some skills don't apply, etc. So that's some of the basic gist as to why I believe games are useful and why I read literature and have started playing these complex games in order to have real world improvement in my reasoning.